everyone. My name is Kyle. I'm a bookseller here at Shelf Life Books. I'm very excited to be hosting the Calgary launch of Sina Queyras' new book, Rooms, Women Writing Wolf. We do have copies here in store, and we are open for browsing. We are also open for curbside pickup and are offering free deliveries here in Calgary with a certain minimum price. All that info is on the Shelf Life Books website, shelflifebooks.ca. I should also point out that tonight's event is being recorded, and the option to turn on the automatic captioning should be enabled if you need that function. Before we get started tonight, I'd like to say that we at Shelf Life Books acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Treaty 7 people. This includes the Nisichawayasihk from Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani First Nations, the Diné Sarsi from Tiohtià, and the Tiohtià Nakota from Morley, the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations. We also walk in the footsteps of the Métis people from Region 3, Métis Nation of Alberta. Joining me here today is Sina Queyras, the author of My Ariel, MXT, Expressway, and Lemon Hound, all from Coach House Books, amongst some other excellent books, novels, literary criticism, other books of poetry. And yeah, Sina was born on land belonging to the Nisichawayasihk. Can you help me with that one, Sina? I've clearly butchered.
That sounded good. The last one sounded fine.
All right, Nisichawayasihk Cree Nation, and live and teach on Tiohtià, Montréal. I had the good fortune to study under Sina at Concordia University. It was a few years ago now, but excellent experience, I must say. So please join me in welcoming Sina Queyras.
Hello.
Hello.
All right. So do you want me to read for a minute? Well, first of all, it's great to be back in Calgary, even if it is virtually. Hi, Marjorie. Hi, Mary Lou. Hi, Sarah. Ian, I can see you because there's not that many here in the Zoom room. I can read. Yeah, I'm very happy to be back. I can read for 15 minutes or so, and then we can have a conversation.
That sounds great to me. Let's do a reading. I have some questions. We can have a nice conversation, and then maybe open things up to the audience if there are any further questions. Does that sound good?
It sounds fine. Yes, I'm happy to read from this book. Yeah, there it is. Oh, matching covers, excellent. All right, and then yeah, I have a lot to say about it as well. So, and I'm eager to answer your questions. But all right. Prologue. I was alone, blissfully so, in the early morning of my writing life. I was trying to complete an assignment about Virginia Woolf for my introduction to literature class. And the more I read, the farther the scaffolding of college, professor, paper slipped away from me. I, whatever I is, was aquatic, song-filled, but not only joyful. The salt of loss, too, rose and fell in me. No writer had ever evoked in me such a response. Nothing had ever felt so familiar and outrageous, so foreign and close. The waves swelled, and in them all of time swirled. For some hours after setting the book down, I lay on the floor, unable to move my body. But inside my mind, my body was swimming through time, simultaneously in several Londons and in many childhoods, in countrysides, in forests with felt edges and padded skies, with figures moving through the air like crows. It was the winter of 1988, and I was grateful to be alone in the little prefab home in Parksville, British Columbia, that I shared with Elle, my then partner, and her brother, because I felt so naked suddenly, my body so brazen, blinding, without gender or the constraint of sex. Shame followed me everywhere in those days. I was often, even when I stood, limp with it. I can see it now in context, a shady, ill-lit place of narrow thinking. The vastness of the space Woolf's texts had created in me didn't so much shock me as soothe, even as they upended everything. Everything should be upended, I thought, and regularly. The lie of propriety oppressed me in every direction. How accumulation mattered, who had power around me, over me, again and again. The lack of care for others was rewarded. Those who could turn a blind eye to the damage they caused gathered more and more status, power, and wealth. What Woolf's text seemed to offer wasn't conventional world building, like how intimately I felt I knew the Shire, for example, a world that takes up but a few pages at the beginning of The Hobbit, or the smell of the riverbank where the child in Joyce Carol Oates' haunting story, The Molesters, plays, and how it had mingled with my own childhood memories of men taking me into forests so much that it made me feel nauseated and powerless. Or in The Handmaid's Tale, Offred's thinking in the rooms that she is forced to circulate in, and made me feel so trapped I sometimes felt I couldn't see beyond my own skin, and I threw the book across the room in anger and then stomped on it and then tore it apart. What good is a world that isn't an answer to the one we are inhabiting? I did not want to toss or tear anything of Woolf's. I simply wanted to sink into it. What was this world Woolf was building? It was interior, but not trapped. It was world building, but not realism. It was active, outward. It was, as Jeanette Winterson later described, elegiac. It was, I thought, elational. This was the tenor of thought that thrummed under the surface of my hours. Waves came and came again, but the sea I was in was not unpleasant. I was buoyed by it, floating through the life that had come to feel so mundane and so far from my values, and yet it was not a sea of depression and passivity. It was molecular and alive. It was ecstatic in its interior reorienting, and also revelatory in how I felt about the relationship of thinking to the natural world. I knew the power of the natural world. I had at times seen waves on the ferry back and forth from the mainland reaching so high they seemed like fists punching the air. I had stepped off the path in the forest and slid thigh deep into the moss and rotted cedar. I'd seen the miniature forests of the West Coast, trees that would normally tower, bonsai'd by the winds. I had witnessed salmon muscling up rivers so thick they looked like a Mediterranean roof you might walk across. I had seen anger and fear, and not only in the eyes of deer, but in owls, frogs, the indignant fox. The waves were all around the little house with its basement filled with pot plants. Perhaps, if a text like this existed and was worth studying, I thought, my yearning wasn't crazy after all. Finally, the cat put her paw on my cheek, and then the dog with her nose on my forearm, and the gentle, plaintive growl, and then my partner's dog with his howl. Speaking of which, I sat up. Perhaps, like Orlando, I had also read that. I'd been asleep for some years and was now someone else, another gender or a gender of my own, and time was somewhere else. Perhaps when I went to the window, I would see that I had entered a new world. Certainly, having left the city, we had done that. Maybe life was a series of such unfurlings. When I got up and tried to step out of the water with my dogs, it did not seem possible. The sea was all around me, but of course you understand, the sea was in me, the waves were me. I made it to the door. There it was still, the forest, the trees like a battalion of stewing creatures. The animals launched themselves, two blonde shapes swimming through sword ferns and salal. We sloshed across the yard to the greenhouse where I was starting plants for the garden, sloshed to the river for our walk, and later the dogs and I piled into my boat of a car and sailed to my sister-in-law's for dinner. The next night, I was off to a restaurant where I worked on the weekends, but everywhere I went, I was inside Woolf's mind, looking out at the strange world I inhabited with its resistance to all things prickly and queer. Each time I rose or sank, a new perspective emerged, an intense rhythm of seeing. Now this, with each break, a new point of view, now solicitous, now timid, now curious. And with each new point of view, my perspective deepened and widened and rose above until I felt like an emotional astronaut, an umbilical cord on my head, connecting me to the vast collective of animals and people and trees. It's all upside down, I thought, the order of priorities. And then suddenly the clouds parted and I began to write. Sentences shot out like arrows dislodged from some buried, dormant part of my mind. Thoughts I had not known existed burst into life. They were simple at first, as they are at the beginning of the waves, a series of I see statements that evolved into longer sentences that offered a contrasting and complex portrait, I thought, of the essence of the text. They collided with the selection of quotes from Woolf, questions and observations that built, as requested from my English assignment, a conception of the author. The writing was euphoric. The statements revealed my attempt to understand not so much who the author was in the first place, but how the writing was working, what it was doing. Not that I wasn't intrigued by the author. I knew nothing about the figure of Woolf outside of her name and that she was a feminist and had written a book about rooms. I knew nothing about Bloomsbury or on a more fundamental level what it truly meant to be educated or have a literary life at all. I was myself barely educated. My body was half inside the McDonald's takeout world of my youth. I had one male foot in the mall, one female foot in a bag of old Dutch potato chips. What on earth was this place she had created? Who was Virginia Woolf? Was she part Bernard, Rhoda, Neville, Lewis, Jenny? Was she all of them? Obviously not, right? Right? I reached up into her sentences as though I were being pulled out of gravity because for the first time in my life, I was encountering writing that felt organically similar to what was happening in my mind. But to be clear, I was not at all in control of the thoughts or the words. My thoughts were broken here and there with cliches and fawning. Sentimentality was possible. Yes, she was sections of them all, and they were all sections of her. We are shaped by time and tide, I wrote, exposed to the elements. I quoted directly from the waves. I have lived 1,000 lives already. Every day I unbury, I dig up. I find relics of myself in the sand that women made thousands of years ago. I allowed more guessing about who or what Woolf was. Of course, the question really being asked here was, who am I? I should say that this quasi-experimental conception of the author was prefaced by an account of how I had read an excerpt from A Room of One's Own and Kew Gardens and an excerpt from A Sketch of the Past before, as I said, hoping to find something a little easier and clearer to say about Woolf. I turned to Orlando and then the waves, which had the effect I begin to describe here. But also that I went on as directed to consult a biographical text as well. But no, almost immediately and thoroughly I rejected the biography. I wanted to simply be immersed in Woolf's thinking, and I said as much. The first whiff of explaining her away I found repulsive. Who were they to say who she was? Who am I? Who am I even now? In truth, I had no idea what was happening then, or whether what I had written in the end was any good, nor could I say that I wanted to know or to have an evaluation of it, for it felt glorious just to be in it, to have the words flowing through me, lifting me from the smallness of myself, knowing that for the moment what I had produced was the sum total of my capabilities. That was satisfying. Having walked inside those books the way I saw myself and all the possibility of realizing the fullness of that self had changed. All of my weaknesses are present in this first Woolf essay, but also the first evidence of the energy that would fuel my writing life over the next 3 decades. The writing of these lines felt sexual, clear, vivid. They were a powerful cognitive behavioral tool I now know. They showed me how to describe who I was, and through them, I began writing myself into being. I handed in my conception of the author and waited. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Sina. Do you want to, you had mentioned you have a fair bit to say about the book. Do you want to do you want to make like an introductory sort of statement about it, or should we just dive right in here?
That's an interesting question. No, I think I think we'll dive in. I think I want to hear your thoughts, and I will elaborate as we go along.
Okay, sounds good. I guess then I would like to start right in the middle of things with the big question you raise and then answer about midway through the book, which is why wolf? And your response in the text is, it is because the text made me. It demanded a response, but it also literally made me. Do you mind unpacking your relationship with Woolf a little bit, and also just how has her work made you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say. I was talking actually this afternoon to Ivan Coyote about, influences and people who kind of like brought us into being. And every time I think about that, and then I think about Woolf, and I just like, this is insane. Like she's like an alien. And particularly if I think about when I was in my early 20s, like she was like from another planet. So it's really mysterious, but it is, again, as I was just saying in my prologue, it's the sense that of having this core orientation unlocked so profoundly, that has been a touchstone that it's like, there's not enough money in the world, there's nothing that can compare in value to my relationship to Woolf's writing. And even though over the years I have like had to like distance myself, like her whole kind of, when I realized the effect of the colonialism, and then started to really look at the domestic arrangements, there were times where I just was like, I can't deal with the privilege and with the kind of myopia of this vision. But then ultimately, there's just nobody else on the planet that has, to me, sums up the potential, or particularly, I think, human potential for kind of empathetic, creative possibility. But then on a more personal note, allows me to see my potential and not realize it. I don't think I've realized my potential, and even like modest amount, which is also something that I find so invigorating about her, because it's also like, much of what people, like we were talking today also, it's like not Bloomsday, Dalloway Day is coming up. Mrs. Dalloway Day. Well, I don't love Mrs. Dalloway. I'm not like a fanatic about Mrs. Dalloway. I find that novel to be too perfect, too coiffed, too precious in some way. That's not the Woolf that made me. The Woolf that made me is, and I guess in another way, it was like maybe the first hint of Buddhism as well, because there's a link in way in which her vision kind of dovetails with kind of Buddhist thinking about interrelatedness and connectivity and that. So it was like the first thing that opened that kind of space up for me. But then that's just like a little, like tiny little opening. And then, you walk into this palatial space with endless ways of, growing your literary consciousness in creative, innovative ways, and critical ways, in a kind of domestic prowess, which she actually achieved in her life, juggling so many things while creating this incredible body of work. And for me, and maybe you might know this a little bit from being in my workshop, the work is really important, but also the quality of life and interconnectedness of everybody sitting around a given table is is also as important. So there's this kind of holistic approach that I see it in her work. And it was one of the first kind of sightings of that for me.
Yeah, I will say that I definitely took that away from your workshop, the sense that writing isn't, it's more than an activity. It's a kind of a way of being, a way of relating to other people and yourself sort of at the same time. I really was struck by the line in the preface where you mentioned that Woolf is articulating your own thoughts, but in a way that you yourself don't have control over yet.
Yeah.
And
yeah, and it's like, and this is not the first time this has happened in my life. Well, actually, maybe the first time I was conscious of it, but it's something that's happened many times in my life where I've been like, oh, wow, I'm in a situation where I'm going to now have to be like, prostrate to the muse for like a decade before I actually understand what the fuck just went on. And that was kind of what it was for her. It's great patience to not need the answers right away, to actually be able to rest with the question. And to be able to rest in discomfort and to rest in like incompleteness. And I think that's why the books I love, The Waves and Orlando, they're not the like, tucked in masterpiece, masterly quality of, the Two Lighthouse or Mrs. Dalloway. They're reaching for something and they're kind of flailing around like these large organic beings.
Well, several of your previous books also foreground your connection to Woolf and other prominent female authors. A favorite of mine is My Ariel, a collection of poetry that writes through Sylvia Plath's Ariel from the perspective that is distinctly your own. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about how you focus like a lifetime of engagement with these authors into a book or a project that has, a beginning and an end.
Well, you can ask my editor, they would have something more bracing to say, probably about the frustration of such projects. But yeah, it's hard. I think it's like it's kind of it's audacious. And I think that like Lemon Hound, the book version, not the website, kind of sort of started to play with this idea of, entering into texts, entering into a body of work, like with Ariel, though, that was a whole other level of intensity that I didn't quite see coming. And I think that when I first conceived of that project, I thought that it would literally, you would be able to go through having her Ariel on one hand and my Ariel on the other, and like literally flip through the pages. And that there would just be these revisions, right? And I did get to that point. At one point, I did have a kind of version of that, but I found it really incredibly boring. And I just thought, I don't think I could put this out in the world. Like me doing that in 2017 or whatever. She's already worked out the formula. She already has done all this. So me just replicating it in 2017 or 16 or whenever I was doing it, it just felt like cheap and wrong. And I remember I was running up the mountain, because I run a lot in the mountain. I remember when I had this realization, I had to like go to the side of the mountain and I literally threw up into the ditch, because I realized that in order to sleep at night, I would now have to take an even bigger risk than she took creating Ariel. And so that's when the book kind of multiplied and took on these bizarre, doublings and that's the danger, because to walk in somebody's shadow And I think maybe this happened a little bit in our class. Sometimes you'd bring in a poem and then somebody would do a replication of the poem the next time. It's very heady. It's very exciting. Like, it's almost why I almost never teach Beckett, because that happens almost immediately, or even Plath. Their style is so powerful that immediately you get somebody will come in with an echo of it, that, and it's not enough just to have an echo of it. You actually have to bring something of equal risk and equal value to the project. And so that's the difficult part. And again, that happened with Woolf. It's never as easy and clean as one wants it to be in the beginning of a project, which is to say, oh, I'm just going to respond to this one book and everything will fit neatly. Well, no, it doesn't.
Well, I do always come away from your books with the feeling that I know you a little bit better than I did before, as a person as well as a writer. But Rooms is something special in that regard. There's so much of you here in this book. There's family history, details of your education, your career, your love life, and a critical element, your body, is so present in this book. As you point out, you put your body on the line with these statements. Can you illuminate the connection between writing and the body, and perhaps writing in your body?
Yeah, that's a really lovely question. Kyle, thank you. I was thinking about this when I was talking to Ivan today. The relationship between bodies that are, well, bodies in general and writing is one thing, but then bodies that are often othered and unsafe in spaces, right? That there is a kind of more amplified, there's almost a way in which, I don't think Ivan does this, but I know that I've certainly been guilty of doing this. And I feel like, there's a relationship with Woolf's idea of burning off the personal, burning off the axes one might have to grind, burning off all of that stuff to sort of get at some creative project, creative gesture, creative narrative that can both capture the rage of the vulnerable body, but without putting the vulnerability of the body in the text. And that's a dance that she does in a lot of her texts. And she does it quite explicitly, I think, in Rooms. And I'm thinking about like the relationship of the body and the way that the text and the kind of way in which a text's lack of propriety can be loud, right? It's like, oh, there's something weird about this text. What is it? There's like, the tone is off. The affect is a little bit too, I don't know, I'm seeing maybe a little breast that I don't want to, or like I don't know, there's just a way in which a text can just have this whiff of the overly personal. And I really was admiring Ivan for the way that they have this kind of narrative scaffolding that provides really, there's a kind of intimacy, and then there's this kind of space, like a moat around them. There's a way in which, like for me, Lemon Hound was a great moat. I didn't, it was like me, but not me. And I could hide behind these beautiful sentences that I could just erect, like beautiful little structures that would contain me. And in Rooms, that was really significantly difficult, because I realized that this new generation that was coming up in my classrooms were asking, what they wanted was a kind of more honest representation of what the body was, the cost of the body being in a given room. And so that made it sort of like a slap down where I had to like take up this challenge and present the physicality in a more, I guess, just in a more uncomfortable for me way. I wasn't really comfortable. I didn't plan on writing many of the scenes that are in rooms. And as I wrote like, it was like a first draft was like 150,000 words or something like that, some around that. And partly that was just like bullshit writing around to try to evade, presenting the body in those specific ways. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, or maybe it starts the conversation about that question.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, that was some of the thinking.
Well, let's talk about the figure of the room, because it is such an important figure for the book and for Woolf. For Woolf, it symbolizes freedom, privacy, and independence, the things that are necessary in order to write.
Yeah.
But you had several dimensions to this figure, including imprisonment, isolation, resignation, but also community and interdependence, particularly in the way that, in a sense, it sort of takes a village to support a room. You touch on this palpable tension between the private space and these social conditions. And I guess, would you speak to that tension a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's a really, really important one. It takes a village to create the room of one's own, regardless of whether that village is acknowledged or not, right? That's the reality. And so we have to be really upfront about who's paying for our village, how many bodies our village is sitting on, or how many bodies our room is sitting on, literally, right? And I think like there's a moment where Woolf has some revelation about that herself in her own class situation, and how she struggles to get out of it, but of course is dependent on it still. Similarly, I think one of the many things I was trying to get across in rooms is the complexity of creating these relationships. That the room, and I wrote an essay on this in 2010 for a conceptual conference in New York. Because one of the things that conceptual writing had given me that I was really excited about was the idea of making a physical space. Conceptual writing, you can create by making constraints, you can kind of create space, and you can literally create space that people can inhabit. And I really love this idea. And I also really love the idea of the accountability. Like, to me, one of the things I like about conceptual writing and conceptual art is the way that it accounts for scale and accumulating, like scale in terms of largeness, but also scale in terms of, like who's stacked up, who's holding up this vision. So, but on the other hand, with the idea of the room, what always has been a huge kind of warning sign for me is that rooms very often get cut off and the door can be closed and you're gone. And a room of your own is really useless unless it's connected to other rooms. A room of your own doesn't really make any sense unless it has its interdependence, right? And Woolf knew this, and I don't know, one of the things I wanted to make clear was how she was always kind of triangulating, always seeing herself in relation to these other spheres, always in relation to art and into the economy and political. And she was never a solo little, fragile lone person whittling away in her room. And so the room is, yes, we all should have a room, but the room needs to be in relation to other rooms, and it needs to understand its relationship to other rooms. And I would love to see more collectives and collective world building and room sharing. And I'm really excited about this as a possibility.
Yeah, yeah. I think later on in the book, you say something along the lines of like a billion rooms of our own or none. You know,
Exactly.
what is the point of having this space all to yourself if it truly is in isolation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's awful.
Well, this question sort of leads on another. And think it's important that we talk about Woolf's magic purse, the 500 pounds a year that she felt was necessary in addition to the room of one's own for a woman to be able to write good fiction.
Yeah.
You mentioned the magic purse as an argument in favor of universal basic income.
Yeah.
And as someone who, like you, comes from a working class background, I found this argument really compelling. Even though, of course, it's used by Woolf in a very different context. Well, now we're living through a time of increased precarity, especially for those who are most vulnerable to systemic injustices. And so I wonder what kind of supports you feel are necessary for writers to have the freedom to create now.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Universal basic income is just a no-brainer, and I think, you know, there's a lot of movement for that happening in Canada, and I don't, you know, I don't think it's an impossibility that is that might happen. But I mean, that's just Canada. Like, go across the border, and it's always been more difficult to imagine in that context, right? In an American context, or I guess American, even UK context. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's really hard. And I think that psychologically actually is the more difficult aspect, because, you know, along with the idea of the room of one's own comes the idea of the prize of one's own and the spectacular golden career of one's own. You know, the great publishing deal contract of one's own. You know, those are all kind of a continuum of the you know, the kind of lyric single genius voice that that pervades. And so there's the idea of the room, but then I think that the bigger problem is just even trying to understand that a writing life doesn't have you know, it doesn't have certain trajectory that includes, you know, winning this prize, getting this teaching job, having, you know, whatever. And I think even if so I worry, what I'm saying is I kind of worry that even if we get universal basic income, we have to then attend to what it actually means to have a writing life and what a writing trajectory you know, might be, and like how it might be just as valuable to have a, you know, writing co-op where people are working on creating, like Derek Beaulieu, or, you know, and a lot of this in the Calgary scene where people are working on zines and they're working in this, creating these worlds. And we have to really think about like what kind of trajectory. It's hard, you know. We all fall prey. We go on Twitter and then we're like, well, there's this person, and now this person has an agent, and now they're getting this book deals. It's so the room is one part, then the psychology and the way in which we think about careers is another huge part. So I think I think whatever the conversations are, they have to be about continually. And I think, you know, like 10 years ago when I was in New York, I remember just being completely lambasted by asking about money. Like, oh my God, you know, like don't ever bring that up again. Like that is not okay. So the money, and then it's like, yeah, because people who have money can afford a room in New York, right? Mortals can't afford a room in New York. So I don't know if that helps to, you know, I think that we need to rethink structures. And I think we've had this incredible opportunity, horrible as it's been with COVID, to actually things have kind of crashed. There's nothing at stake. There's nothing really to lose right now by moving to a different model. And we all know that because we can all see the icebergs melting, and we all know that like we need to rethink how we think about moving around cities and what cities are, let alone like what our rooms are and what our writing practices are. But many of us, and I can understand why, because it's been hard and we're freaked out, kind of just want to get everything back to what that normal was, even though most of us would have said, wait a minute, that normal wasn't really something I was terribly invested in. Anything being possible, wouldn't I maybe want to think about a different way of moving around the world, operating, writing criticism, disseminating reviews and literary conversations? Why do we want to go back to that in particular?
Yeah, as well as everything else that might fall outside of what we might consider a writing life, with especially with like climate catastrophes, it's hard to write when you have this anxiety sort of hanging over your head. I know some people find it motivating. It's the time is short, I got to get out there. I find it in a way sort of paralyzing. It's easier to move through that feeling of paralysis in dialogue with people. Maybe what is called for is a shakeup of the way that we relate to each other in the writing world.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I saw this crazy movie the other night, Everyone Everywhere at Once. Have you seen this movie?
Yes, yeah.
Well, I'd like the literary equivalent of that, please. Like, what I loved about that movie is that it's like, as an allegory for our moment, it was just like, yeah, don't get stuck in believing these hyped up, markers of living that were missing, but we didn't like them when they were there in the first place. Mm-hmm. And what matters is human connection. What matters is being able to see beyond those restrictive entities and structures and neoliberal kind of thinking that is based on how many bodies you can stack up under you, because really that's what a billionaire is doing, right? There's nothing, they're accumulating bodies, basically. It's not, the money doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from taking resources from the rest of the planet. It's really obscene. Mm. And I don't think that we don't actually see how obscene it is. Otherwise it would be like, we would just all be walking around throwing up every time we saw the Bezos and the Elon Musks of the world, rather than like, affecting them.
At the end of the second chapter, you write, service. Women are still not finding a way to flourish outside of service. There are so many demands on faculty, on grad students, and on writing community members of all types, especially those who are female identified, to do the necessary and oftentimes thankless work of supporting the community, keeping the wheels turning. On the other hand, part of the job is making space for other people, and particularly those who come up after you. And I think this is something that you're quite adept at. And I'm wondering how you balance the need to foster your own writing practice with the demand to perform acts of service.
Well, it's a really beautiful, easy thing to do when the service that you are able to provide is useful to the community and pleasurable to yourself. That's really what you want. That is the balance you want to find. You want to find out what you have to offer that actually doesn't drain you, but rather feeds you, right? And then you want to figure out a way to give that to the community. That's like the ultimate. But then, like this, and that's sort of what I did with Lemon Hound. And as long, for a long time when I didn't, I wasn't worried about financial stuff. I wasn't worried about, it kind of started to fall apart when the university wanted to make it part of its curriculum and part of its like bring it into the fold and use it as a kind of way to attract students and whatever. And then all of a sudden, and you're in this model of doing short grants, trying to figure out money, and you just become a part of this, very easily, I should say. I want to say very easily, because it's not a done deal, right? Universities, all systems are permeable, and they can and should be broken into and fucked around with and completely decentralized and made, remade. But it's really easy to get into those systems and just you fall into this really horrible place where everything is just being quantified and you're just basically doing paperwork for people. And then it's a system where, like many of the systems in our world, where the people who can ignore the demands of their students, like people who can like basically put off that stuff and protect their creative and research time, are rewarded from the system, right? So it's like this, most people don't understand this. Like teaching in the university is actually the least, like nobody cares. So if you're meeting, if you have a professor who's like actually reaching out to you and like worried about your work, not your reflection of their work, that person's probably not succeeding in the university system the way that the university is set up for them to succeed. Or, as is probably the case with some of the people in your department, they're doing 3 times of the service as their colleagues. And they're not getting paid for that or remunerated. So, it's really difficult. What you can do though, is you can enter into the system and you can begin to create cross-pollinate other departments. You have to find people who are brave enough, young enough, like-minded enough that they can start to demand those changes, like to say, wait a minute, I just spent 6 years doing sexual climate reviews and sexual misconduct, accounting and student counseling and like all this stuff that it should account in these systems, right? This should account for something. It's necessary university work. So you could start to make those arguments and you can start to say, my pedagogy is about creating a realistic, not a realistic, I hate realism. It's not at all what I want to say. A meaningful space for students to be able to be truly connect to their creative impulses in a way that is meaningful and useful, actually. Not a word many people want to hear in relation to art, but I don't mind using it, to the moment, like connects to the moment. So that's why I like that movie, for example, coming back to that, because it was so on the nose in terms of like, I saw it as an allegory for our moment in many ways, but it had nothing also to do with our moment. So it was just like this way in which it could allow the viewer to see out and through into other possibilities. And that's really what we need in this moment. And it's hard because I just want to write about, I miss, this species and I miss this species and I want to lament for the ice. And I really do. But I know that's not what we need because we're all sitting there watching. So we need to find a way to see it, really see it and confront it, but also see through it and to see where we can go.
Right. Yeah, it does. It does. I have one more question and I want to squeeze it in before we invite some questions from the audience here. I have a little bit of a preamble though, so buckle up. On a personal level, I would like to say that your influence as an instructor and a mentor has been immeasurably important to me. And so I want to share an anecdote. I'm convinced that the first time that I went to your office hours changed the trajectory of my life. at very least, it's a touchstone memory that I return to whenever I'm starting to feel like I have everything figured out. Um, so it's the first time sitting across the desk from you, and after a little bit of, you asked me some questions about my creative goals and so on, and then you asked which poets I admire. Who am I reading? And I said something like, "Oh, the philosophical poets." And you're like, "Okay, who's that?" And I'm pretty sure I said Wordsworth. I stammered it out, and I don't even know how to describe the expression on your face, but it'll live in my mind forever. And you gave me a list of books and poets that I should look into: Lisa Robertson, Dion Brand, Erin Moray, Claudia Rankine, Juliana Spar, and many others. I remember scrambling to get my pen out so I could get all these names down. And since then, those authors, their work have formed sort of the bedrock of my poetic explorations. When I left your office, I was feeling scandalized, not by you. I think I was feeling scandalized by, because I knew so little. And more importantly, I had no clue how ignorant I was about my own intellectual blind spots. I just assumed that what I knew or was aware of was what was out there. And that was the long and the short of it. But you put me on the path, not just as a budding poet, but also as an active learner, as a member of the literary community, and as a feminist. I can't really recall any other single conversation with a person that has made such an impact on me. And you strike me as somebody who honors your influences, like you have with Woolf. How do you conceive of your influence, of the influence you have with your students and with your admirers, such as myself?
Wow. Well, I'm honored, Kyle. And you walked into my office on already energetic and very obviously vivacious and precocious, talented young student. So so that's really a gift. I take it very seriously, partly because of how little I felt that how much I wanted it, and how those every little tiny thing that professors gave me, every tiny thing. I mean, even just every morsel is just sucked up into my brain. And ridiculous, useless lessons too sometimes. But the earnestness with which I was given those, it warms me. Those little lessons, which sometimes are, they're absolutely just silly and even wrong, but because of the way they were delivered to me, I love them. So thank you for that, and I do take it seriously. I was having a series of interviews with one of my old professors, actually, Daphne Marlatt, who I talk about in this book. And the more I talk to her, we've known each other now 30 years. And if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I think I would have mentioned her as somebody who had influenced me. But the more I talk to her, the more I want to talk to her. Like the way in which her influence has rested in me it sort of felt just like this dormant thing. I wouldn't have described it as this, even an exciting, or I just didn't actually understand how much she had influenced me and how that influence had grown. And I kept touching into it and coming back to it. And I'm all thinking about Woolf, but no, here's this actual person in the world who's alive and writing still and completely engaged. So I guess I think about that because she was way more influential than I even understand. And I too remember clearly the things that she said to me in the classroom. And sometimes have said them to my students as well. And I feel like it just feels like an incredible gift to be able to do that. I do also think that I am the kind of person who takes risks in my work for sure, but also in the classroom. And that I know that that doesn't always, that doesn't always go over well. So there has been instances where I've, pulled the rug out from somebody and they have not loved it. And they have been really angry at me. And probably are still really angry at me. So just to say that to really be present in the classroom is a huge risk. And it's partly why many people don't do it. They kind of stick to a script because, it's a risk. But I feel like one of the things, and it's maybe the last thing I need to say about it, I decided early on, or I realized, because this is who I am. It's not like but I realized that I didn't want to change it because I actually want my students to be able to take risks. So if I don't take risks and risk failing, then it's not fair to ask them to take risks and to risk failing. So that is a basic kind of something I'll never let go of in the classroom.
Okay, well, thank you. With our remaining few minutes here, I'm wondering if any of our participants have a question. You're more than welcome to drop it in the chat here and I can read it aloud, or you can use the raise hand function and we can address it. In the meantime, I will say that I did quite appreciate your risk taking in the class. It encouraged me to take some risks. I look back on some of those poems and like, what am I thinking? But it's also being in the space of trying things on and being able to walk away from them if they don't work.
Well, if not there, where, right? If you don't do it there, it's where you should. Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't see any hands raised.
No hands?
How about we can maybe unmute and say hello and maybe thank Sina for their time and wisdom tonight.